In Japan, there is a legend of a great buried treasure.
You would be talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of gold coins in today's money.
It is the supposed fortune of a mighty warlord, buried deep in the mountains.
It's in a bit of Japan that's pretty much ignored.
This warlord, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, was the last of his kind, the last shogun of Japan.
The shogunate stayed for 250 years, 15 generations.
The key to his riches lay with a faithful servant who carried his secret to the grave.
He was just rounded up suddenly and decapitated.
Two rival families are locked in a race to find this fabulous treasure.
It was such an important part of Japan's history. If only you could dig up some bit from the time.
Their quest would bridge generations, lasting more than a century, and capture the imagination of a country.
This just kind of fed into people's desire to believe in some kind of fantasy.
This is the story of an extraordinary treasure hunt, a bitter rivalry, and a fortune beyond imagination. The lost treasure of the last shogun. At the turn of the 21st century, an elderly man spent his last days digging deep in the mountains of central Japan. He was looking for gold.
Japan is very mountainous, so there's huge numbers of areas where potentially somebody could have gone and sequestered some stuff.
His name was Mizuno Tomeyuki. The fortune he sought was a treasure that was lost almost 140 years previously.
According to the most popular version of the legends, there were originally over 4 or 5 million coins total. So you would be talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of gold coins in today's money.
Mizuno Tomeyuki had spent his entire life on a quest for this vast hoard of coins, and felt he was on the verge of an extraordinary breakthrough.
We, Mizuno, can dig for 3, 4, 5, even 100 generations, because warriors from the samurai days entrusted this to us. If we hadn't been entrusted with this, it would be just some treasure hunt, and I would have stopped long ago. I'm not that stupid.
Where did all this money come from, and why did it mysteriously vanish? The roots of the legend stretch back to a time of great upheaval. 1866. For 263 years, one family, the House of Tokugawa, held the reins of power. They seized the country in a violent insurrection, then brought centuries of peace to this wild land.
Historically, it's been very hard to hold the country together. It always falls apart. Civil wars repeatedly take place. If you imagine Switzerland, where you have mountain, valley, torrent, another mountain, another torrent, and imagine that continuing from Stockholm to Naples. That's what Japan is.
So far, there had been 15 generations of Tokugawa rulers, but they were not emperors. They were shoguns.
Shogun literally means barbarian subduing generalissimo. And it's a title that is given to someone officially by the emperor who lives in Kyoto.
The latest of this long line was Tokugawa Yoshinobu. In theory, he was a military commander who served at the emperor's pleasure. In practice, he ruled supreme, and all bowed to him. From his ancestral home at Edo Castle, the shogun governed with the aid of a vast aristocratic class, the samurai. It was an ancient feudal system that had endured for centuries.
The shogunal system was created early in the 17th century, and the first shogun was deified. That made it very difficult ever to change anything that he had set in place.
From his exalted position, the shogun not only held the reins of power, but wealth beyond imagination. At his court, a group of his most loyal and trusted samurai were given the task of administering his vast fortune. One of them was a man named Oguri Tadamasa.
Oguri Tadamasa is what's called a bannerman. He's one of about 5,000 mid-ranking samurai who are loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate and really function as mid-level bureaucrats in the regime.
He was well-educated bureaucrat, come from a decent family. When he was young, people very quickly realized he had both mastered the military skills but also kind of literature and poetry and things like that, which was what you needed in order to have legitimacy in the top levels of the Japanese bureaucracy.
Oguri reached an exalted position as the shogun's commissioner of finance. His role was to account for the huge sums paid to the shogun in taxation. Every warlord owed the shogun an annual tribute, and all that wealth passed through Oguri's hands.
Essentially, he was the accountant for the Tokugawa regime itself. And this was a very important position because the Tokugawa shogunate needed money not only to pay all of its samurai, but to manage any reforms that they wanted to pursue.
Oguri knew that reforms were badly needed. Life in Japan had barely changed in 200 years. Yet beyond her shores, the world was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Oguri was one of the few Japanese who had been abroad and seen the benefits this brought to Western nations. He developed grand plans to modernize his deeply traditional society.
Oguri was just stunned by how far behind Japan was in terms of modern infrastructure. He wanted to create a postal system, he wanted to create a shipyard to kind of imitate what the West had. So he was one of the most vocal supporters of Westernization, if you will.
But the shogun was not interested in change. And while he continued to live in splendor, the rest of Japan struggled in dire poverty.
95% of people, they were living in little miserable huts in the countryside as they had done for 1,000 years. They never left their village. Life was hard and miserable and cold in winter and hot in summer, and they died young.
This imbalance bred a wave of resentment that slowly spread through the country. A group of disaffected warlords, banished to the farthest corners of Japan, began to plot against the shogun.
One starts to get already feelings that the shogunate's outlasted its usefulness, and there comes a movement to return power to the emperor.
The conspirators were deeply loyal to the 16-year-old Emperor Meiji. In 1868, they hatch a plot to restore him to power and grab the wealth of the shogun for themselves. Encouraged by his growing band of supporters, Meiji orders the shogun to resign and sends his troops to remove him. The response from the shogun is not what anyone expected.
When the shogunate collapses, it's actually quite startling. The shogun kind of like retires. He doesn't kill himself, he doesn't set the city on fire, he just goes off and lives in the country for the rest of his life.
The shogun was gone. Without their master's protection, all of the Tokugawa retainers were in great danger. None more so than Oguri Tadamasa, the man in charge of the shogun's treasury. Oguri knew that the Meiji forces would be coming for him. They desperately wanted the shogun's vast wealth, and he would be tortured and killed in their efforts to find it. So he too fled the castle. But far from saving his own life, Oguri put himself at even greater risk. His flight sparked a rumor that would make him imperial enemy number one.
When Oguri was moving out, he had a lot of luggage with him. Some of those boxes were coin boxes, of course. So people thought that there must be coins in there.
Oguri escaped just in time.
When the emperor's forces arrive in Edo Castle, they immediately go into the treasuries and find that there are no coins there at all.
The treasuries were empty. The vast wealth of the Shogun had vanished.
The Meiji forces just can't believe that there's no money at all. Someone must have the money somewhere. In one of the famous stories, they ask one of the Tokugawa samurai, "Where's all the money?" He tells them, "I don't know, but you should ask Oguri, the commissioner of finance."
But where was Oguri? And where could he have hidden such a large cache of money?
It came to their attention that Oguri had disappeared. There were also some rumours at the time from witnesses who claimed to have seen a man getting off of a boat in Gunma Prefecture, laden, and going off and potentially hiding something.
Gunma Prefecture was Oguri's ancestral home. It was a wild region, about 100 miles inland from Edo.
Gunma is a fairly high area with many mountainous plateaus. It's wild, it's far from everywhere.
It's very rural. It's in a bit of Japan that's pretty much ignored.
In other words, it was the ideal location to conceal a fortune. Oguri was now hiding here, in a Buddhist temple on the slopes of a dormant volcano, Mount Akagi. The rumor that he had millions of coins in his possession made him a marked man. A matter of days after his arrival, people came to rob him.
A group of about 10 gangsters or so whip up a mob of up to 700 people, and they essentially send a messenger to Oguri telling him to hand over all of the money that he has. Oguri sends a messenger with about 50 coins and says, "Look, this is really all I have." They don't believe him, and this mob attacks the temple where Oguri is staying, and Oguri and his retainers rout the mob and kill many of the gangsters.
Oguri and a small band of servants survive this attack in a stunning display of martial skill. But it was a hollow victory. Emperor Meiji now saw him as a serious threat to the new regime. Anyone with so much might and so much money had to be eliminated.
Because Oguri demonstrated that he has some kind of military expertise, and he has retainers with him and also village men with him who know how to fight, it is thought by the Meiji forces that perhaps Oguri is plotting to launch a counterattack.
A detachment of the emperor's best samurai are sent to kill Oguri. He was declared an outlaw on the spot and summarily sentenced to death.
But because Oguri was just rounded up suddenly and accused of being a criminal, he was just decapitated.
The next day, Oguri's family and the last of his loyal followers are rounded up too. They are also executed. The only ones who knew the treasure's whereabouts were dead. Yet from the ashes of Oguri's household, the legend of the lost treasure of the last Shogun was born. With the restoration of the emperor, Japan entered a brave new world.
After the Meiji Emperor took over, Japan changed dramatically, incredibly quickly. It was full-on modernization.
The feudal system was abolished. Old Edo was renamed Tokyo, and Japan leaped into the white heat of the Industrial Revolution. The world of the Shogun was consigned to history.
When the Meiji regime came to power, they had to villainize the previous regime. So the Tokugawa was turned into a kind of dark, primitive, unprogressive, feudal time.
Within a few short years, Oguri Tadamasa was all but forgotten. Though ironically his ideas about shipyards postal systems, and other newfangled technology were adopted wholesale. But one man could not let go of the past. His name was Nakajima Kurando. He would be the first in a long line of treasure hunters.
Nakajima Kurando supposedly worked within the Commission of Finance as a very low-ranking bureaucrat.
This petty bureaucrat claimed he was a noble samurai and one of Aguri Taramasa's most loyal retainers. Somehow, he escaped death at the hands of the emperor's men, and he knew about the existence of the hidden gold. Sometime in the late 1870s, he began to search for it. He believed it was somewhere in the wild terrain of Mount Akagi, where his master Oguri had died several years earlier. He enlisted an American railwayman, one of thousands of foreigners trying to make their fortune in the new Japan. The American had two things that Nakajima needed: money to fund an expedition, and dynamite to blast into the hard rock of the mountain.
Nakajima buys land and says to this American, "Here, I found this gold coin and there's more of it up there. You can go digging in there and find it."
The pair dug together for months. However, no gold was found. Believing he had been duped, the American sued Nakajima. And Nakajima was sentenced to 2 years in prison for fraud. After his release, this once proud samurai was destitute. He was left homeless on the streets of Tokyo and had to seek shelter with some old family friends, the Mizunos. During his stay in the Mizuno house, Nakajima quickly made an impression with several members of the family, especially Mrs. Mizuno and her oldest son, Tomoyoshi.
Mizuno Tomoyoshi was a young man. He remembers Nakajima essentially having an illicit relationship with his mother after his father died.
For some months, Nakajima continued as a live-in lover for Mrs. Mizuno. In that time, he also became an inspiration to her son. Tomoyoshi came to regard him as a stepfather. Yet despite their close relationship, Nakajima kept the legend of the gold a closely guarded secret. Then, without warning, Nakajima strangely vanished. Tomoyoshi took the disappearance particularly hard. He assumed he would never again hear from the man he once called his dad. He was wrong. A decade after he went missing, Nakajima Kurando broke his silence.
One day, after not seeing Nakajima for some 10 years, a letter suddenly arrives.
In the letter, Nakajima explains that he is dying. He begs Tomoyoshi's forgiveness and pleads for his adopted son to come to see him one last time. He had to tell Tomoyoshi a secret about the lost treasure of the last Shogun.
So Mizuno Tomoyoshi visits Nakajima as he's sick and dying, and is essentially given a bunch of documents and told to go find the gold.
When they met, Nakajima revealed that in all his years away, he had been desperately searching for the hidden treasure. To Tomoyoshi's utter amazement, Nakajima asked him to continue the quest and gave him all of his research.
It doesn't have a map and it doesn't say the treasure is here, but it supposedly has all these puzzles that'll help him find the treasure.
Just days after this encounter, Nakajima died. Tomoyoshi was shocked at the secret life of his stepfather. To him, the whole idea of the quest seemed ludicrous. Mount Akagi is 6,000 feet high and covers hundreds of square miles. The gold could be anywhere, and Nakajima's documents offered no concrete information. But around the turn of the 20th century, his life took a dramatic turn.
It seems that the real tipping point for Mizuno was when his wife suddenly died of pneumonia.
In the wake of this devastating loss, Tomoyoshi fell back on the legacy of the lost treasure and threw himself into Nakajima's cryptic research.
He essentially has an emotional crisis, sells his business, sells his house, and moves out to Mount Akagi in Gunma Prefecture to begin buying land and looking for the treasure.
Tomoyoshi made a solemn vow to carry on Nakajima's quest for the lost treasure of the Shogun. It wasn't long before he made a breakthrough in deciphering some of the arcane riddles, and that, in turn, led to his first real discovery.
He claims to have found a small gold statue. He also claims to have these copper plates that have markings on them and a little map.
Tomoyoshi's entire life was now dedicated to the search for gold.
He goes around and tells people that he has these things in order to get money to continue digging for the gold in Mount Akagi.
For almost 40 years, he dug and dug and dug. He even found a new wife who agreed to help him in his search and started a family. All the while, with no job to speak of, Tomoyoshi burned through the savings he built up from his previous life.
When he starts off, he's rather wealthy. He was a real estate guy in Tokyo, and he had a lot of money with him when he first moved out there, but he gradually ran out of money.
The quest for the treasure bankrupted Tomoyoshi. But whatever troubles he had, he ignored them. He was obsessed with only one thing: finding the Shogun's gold. Yet no matter how deep he went, no matter how carefully he scrutinized the clues in his growing pile of documents, he found nothing. In 1926, Mizuno Tomoyoshi died, heartbroken and penniless. Tomoyoshi's son, Mizuno Aizaburo, was a policeman who wanted nothing to do with buried treasure. But Aizaburo's mother was desperate to continue the search. She begged Aizaburo to carry on the family quest.
After Tomoyoshi dies, Tomoyoshi's wife tells her son, look, your father felt that you were the one who really should be digging for treasure, and so she gives Aizaburo all of the documents that Tomoyoshi had.
Aizaburo felt he had no choice but to honor his father's wishes. He quit his job and moved to Mount Akagi. The torch had passed to a new generation.
In a way, this tradition of treasure hunting has become associated with the Mizuno family, so they're the experts, and they have this lineage as well.
Aizaburo had inherited all of Nakajima Kurando's documents, and still more research that his father had done in 40 years of searching. Still, no gold had yet been found, and the vast bulk of Mount Akagi remained unexplored. Where to start?
He does continue, in some part, digging some of the tunnels that his father had started, but through his own research, he also starts digging other tunnels around Mount Akagi.
After just a few months of digging, some valuable new clues were uncovered.
And they do find this kind of stone tortoise with strange writing on it, and they see that as a sign that this is a clue that will lead us closer to the treasure.
Aizaburo's search continued into the 1930s. But as he dug on, Japan was changing around him. The country harbored vast imperial ambitions, and it was marching steadily towards war. At this time, there was a newfound interest in Oguri Tadamasa, the last shogun's most fervent modernizer, and the source of the shogun's treasure legend.
In the late 1920s and early 1930s, there's an Oguri boom. He really becomes a kind of national hero, a supporter of the Japanese Navy, and there are lots of books and biographies written about him.
One man decided to use Oguri's newly restored good name for his own ends, to seek out the shogun's missing fortune. He was called Kawahara Hidemori. Now the Mizunos had a rival, and the race to find the treasure was heating up.
Kawahara Hidemori decides to claim that he is the grandson of an illicit relationship between Oguri and some mistress.
As Oguri's illegitimate grandson, Kawahara believed only he had the right to search for the shogun's treasure. He had been researching likely burial sites for years. But before he could begin his dig, he needed to raise a substantial amount of money. In 1934, he launched a publicity drive. Taking advantage of the nationalist sentiment of the day, Kawahara arranged a press conference at the Buddhist temple where the severed head of Oguri Tadamasa was supposedly buried.
He becomes very popular in the 1930s among treasure hunters. He shows up with a kimono with the Oguri family crest on it and essentially says that he's here to, help find the treasure.
Before a small crowd at the temple, Kawahara promised to completely refurbish it in Oguri's memory and donate the rest of the money to the nation, minus his own cut for expenses, of course. But then the chief monk of the temple unexpectedly intervened. He had been watching Kawahara's performance and didn't believe a word. He stepped in front of the crowd himself to denounce Kawahara as a fraud. In the monk's opinion, Kawahara was definitely not Oguri's grandson, and Oguri himself would not have approved of this whole charade. Still, many members of the Japanese public bought into his story and gave money. Kawahara also attracted one major sponsor, a shady pachinko gambling boss. Awash with money, Kawahara began his own dig for the treasure. Unlike the Mizuno family, he claimed the gold was not on Mount Akagi, but in a small village to the southwest of Tokyo. Like his rivals, Kawahara dug for many fruitless years. Nothing stopped his relentless quest or the flow of money from well-wishers. Not even the Second World War. Indeed, his promise to donate any gold he found to the Japanese nation was a source of hope in those turbulent years.
Throughout the war and even into the 1950s, Kawahara continues to dig in all sorts of places south of Tokyo and earns a lot of money from people who he convinces that this story is true.
By the early 1960s, Kawahara had been searching for almost 30 years. Now Japan was undergoing a massive economic revival, and Kawahara's gambling boss patron was a rich man. His change in fortunes helped take the expedition to a new level.
In this period, Japan performs an economic miracle. It's absolutely incredible. And the middle class expands, and everybody seems to be doing incredibly well out of this economic nationalism.
Unlike the Mizunos, struggling in poverty, Kawahara could afford to delve far underground. He dug a deep mine with an electric lift and the latest groundwater pumps to keep the site dry. He also had 13 workers to help him excavate. With these new resources, he raced ahead in the contest to uncover the gold. He dug down 250 feet to the supposed location of the great chests of coins. But, despite his well-financed operation, Kawahara Hidemori, the alleged illegitimate grandson of Oguri, was unable to find any treasure. In 1967, he died, but still, the legend of the treasure lived on.
People were aware of this idea of the Tokugawa treasure. In the 1970s, the Yomiuri newspaper ran a massive series on this idea of hidden treasure. Every single article said, well, this is the legend and nothing's been found. This is the legend, but nothing's been found. These people were searching and they didn't find anything. But this went on and on and on for 16 separate articles.
Rumors of buried treasure rumbled on for decades after Kawahara's death, and the legend became part of Japanese popular culture. But it was not until the 1990s that another serious effort was made to find it. This time, it was the Mizunos, the rival treasure-hunting family, that would come closer than ever to unlocking the mystery of the Shogun's lost fortune. 2 generations of the family, Tomoyoshi and his son Aizaburo, had been digging on the slopes of Mount Akagi for nearly a century. Now a 3rd generation of Mizuno treasure hunters was about to enter the game. Mizuno Tomoyuki, the son of Aizaburo. Like his father and his grandfather before him, he was highly skeptical of the legend.
Initially, he did not want any part of the treasure hunting. He thought it was a total sham. He didn't believe that the Tokugawa shogunate would have buried gold coins, and basically he went off on his own in Tokyo and worked in a variety of jobs.
But Tomoyuki could not resist the pull of the quest that his family had been pursuing since the late 19th century. It was not simply a question of finding the money. It was a matter of family honor.
There's the weight of carrying on the family tradition, which is established in Japanese culture and history and society. This idea of you trying very, very hard until the end, this idea of gambaru, which means to work hard. You will persevere through whatever comes along, and you will ultimately succeed in the end. This is very much instilled in people in Japan at a very, very early age.
Tomoyuki decided that he must follow in the footsteps of his forebears and give up his day job in Tokyo. He swore to dedicate his life to the completion of this epic quest.
Was just attracted by the legacy of his father and his grandfather. And he also became convinced because of all these old documents that his grandfather had from the 19th century. So he began doing research on his own and began digging a whole separate series of tunnels separate from his father and grandfather.
Tomoyuki's quest coincided with a new time of upheaval in Japan. The economy had collapsed, and a national mood of depression set in. The Japanese media began casting around for a hero.
The 1990s is called the lost decade.
Japan's lost decade is about economic stagnation. One should remember that that stagnation came after a protracted period of enormous growth, which could not have been maintained forever.
Not only was there economic crisis, but there was political scandal, a natural disaster, a terrorist attack in Tokyo. And this just kind of fed into people's desire to believe in some kind of fantasy.
And what better fantasy than the legendary lost treasure of the Shogun? One enterprising television network called Mizuno Tomoyuki to see if he wanted to be on TV.
In the early 1990s, there was a Japanese entertainment show appropriately called Gimme a Break.
It follows a pattern of Japanese television shows that you still get today. It'll have a number of celebrities interviewing other celebrities, music, animation, sketches, all put together in a 2-hour format.
A Japanese copywriter who grew up in Gunma was familiar with the legend, and he decided to produce a show about the treasure hunting in Mount Akagi.
In their call to Tomoyuki, the producers explained they wanted to cast him and his family as modern-day heroes, men determined to succeed in the face of insurmountable odds. Men who embodied the noble idea of Ganbaro.
It's entirely sensible for them to get in contact with the Mizunos and try and use their expertise, but also to legitimize what they're doing. They're not just rushing off into Gunma Prefecture with a load of cranes and digging holes. They've got the guy, and he's the person who's going to make sure we do this properly.
It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The producers of Gimme a Break got a never-ending real-life soap opera to inspire the nation. In return, Tomoyuki received more resources than he could ever dream of. After years in the wilderness, the Mizunos were back, with the best chance they would ever have of striking gold.
The Mizuno, they've been searching for 120 years and haven't found anything. If a TV producer says to you, we're going to give you 12 cranes and loads of digging equipment, would you like to get on board? I mean, for him, this is a huge boon, because he doesn't have to do it on his own.
The whole nation seemed to be willing Tomoyuki on, and with his help, the TV company found gold, ratings gold.
There would be these huge backhoes and cranes that would dig this enormous pit, almost the size of a rock quarry. And they would find these horizontal tunnels, and so they would go digging in there, and then some earth would fall in a funny way, and they would say, aha, someone must have buried something there. They would find a few bottles, which was an indication that perhaps Oguri's French connections had wine out here and dropped a bottle long ago.
Altogether, the network revisited the Mount Akagi treasure site 10 times in the 1990s, each time with a more elaborate and expensive effort to find the hidden treasure.
When they find lots and lots of tunnels, what they're finding are the tunnels that were dug in the 1930s in order to find the treasure. But that is conveniently left out of the story because it's not very exciting.
This was no longer about logic, it was about magic. Fueled by growing viewer numbers, the search soon became completely detached from reality.
When more money started coming in to produce the show, they hired a few American psychics to come over. They flew over Mount Akagi in a helicopter to try to feel the psychic power of where the treasure would be buried. They also hired an esoteric Buddhist monk to pray to the ancestors to find where the treasure was. And each episode ended with a cliffhanger that, something had just been found. So that would get people to watch the next time.
In the final installment, in 1999, the dig reached fever pitch. By now, the Mizuno excavation works resembled something like an open-cast mine. It descended fully 200 feet below the surface of the mountain. A network of tunnels, dug over generations by the Mizunos, went down even further still. In one final dramatic push, a huge industrial mining drill was brought in to dig still further, hoping to find a hidden cavern containing the gold. But the media frenzy had overwhelmed Tomoyuki. He came to believe the TV company did not care about the treasure itself. All they wanted was a grand spectacle to please their audience.
It seems that in the later episodes, Mizuno felt that they were going on the wrong track. And he almost felt that there was a rivalry between this team and his own search. And he eventually dropped out of the project altogether.
The TV audience soon began to dwindle, and the show was eventually cancelled. Tomoyuki was alone once more, and still, he pressed on with his dig.
There was always some aspect, something that made them feel like we're almost 90% there. And so he couldn't give up.
Meanwhile, the Mizuno's rivals for the treasure, the Kawahara family, had been laboring away 140 miles to the south, largely under the radar since the death of Kawahara Hidemori in 1967. The quest to find the lost treasure had passed from old Hidemori to his son, Kawahara Jiro. In his early digs, Jiro made a number of discoveries, which he claimed were clear evidence that the gold itself was only a few meters further down.
He claims to have found little objects here and there, and those objects he gives as proof that he's closer to the treasure legend, and of course that makes it easier for him to convince people to give him money.
Among the objects he found were human bones and other Tokugawa-era artifacts, pointing towards the treasure's location. In the year 2000, Jiro took a leaf from his father's book and launched a publicity drive. Just like his father, the thing he wanted was money. The press descended on the same location where his father had appeared almost 70 years before. There, they witnessed Kawahara unveiling a bronze sword and a golden coin, dating from the time of the Tokugawa shogunate. But however much Jiro insisted his artifacts were genuine, the public was now quite skeptical of the whole story.
When experts look at the objects, they find out that essentially these are objects that he bought at a local antique store.
Jiro's claim to be on the verge of finding the treasure was widely denounced, and he seemed to have little hard evidence to back his story up. The Kawahara family's hunt for the treasure was over. The latest generation, Jiro's son, has abandoned the quest completely.
The youngest member of the family wants absolutely nothing to do with his father's search for buried treasure and is actually quite embarrassed by it.
But what of Mizuno Tomoyuki, the unlikely star of Gimme a Break? In 2006, another filmmaker caught up with him. These are some of the extraordinary images he captured. Now a wizened old man dying of cancer, the proud treasure hunter felt he had been cursed by 2 generations of his family. He could not give up his quest, ever.
But that's the star I've been born under with this family. I have this sense of responsibility that I have to do this. That's why I do it. Is there anyone else who has this kind of responsibility? If so, I'd like to meet them. Is there anyone else in Japan who has been entrusted by the samurai of the past?
Someone asked him once, what would you do if you found the treasure? And he said, I would kick it really hard because my family struggled and lost a lot of money and energy in finding this. But he just felt that it was his destiny, his fate, to find this treasure. A fate that no one else but he and his family would be able to fulfill.
After almost 140 years of searching, no one has yet found any gold. So does the treasure really exist? Or was the legend just that?
There has been a lot of stories about the shogunate, the kind of shogunate that wouldn't die. It was such an important part of Japan's history. There's a kind of romantic feeling we don't want it to go away. Only you could dig up some bit from the time.
Despite all of the research done down the years by the Mizuno family, a more objective examination of the facts show that, in all likelihood, there was no money buried in the first place.
There's absolutely no evidence and no possibility that there was buried treasure anywhere.
This is because, in Japan, during the shogunate, gold coins were not used as a measure of wealth.
It's a sort of Western notion that you have a kind of a jewel tower in which you put all these rich things, and as long as they're in there, you're rich. But for Japan, you're simply having gold sitting in a tower was not of a great deal of use to anyone.
Instead, the great lords of the era counted their riches using a different material: rice.
The standard unit of exchange was rice, and Rice is a wonderful unit of exchange because if you get hungry, you can eat it, but also it can be broken up into any sizes. Also, it lasts for quite a long time. And the principal unit of rice was what they call a koku. And a koku, it's enough to sustain an adult for a year.
A junior samurai might earn 100 koku a year. The higher up the social scale he was, the more koku he would be entitled to as tribute from the farmers on his land. The leading lords, such as the Shogun himself, would have each claimed more than 1 million koku annually. In fact, the entire class structure of Japan during the shogunate was built around the growing and storage of rice. This was helpful for feeding armies. But when it came to acquiring desirable goods like silk, pottery, or weapons, rice was useless.
The samurai class are paid in rice yield. The merchants operate in coin. You can't buy things with rice, so that the merchants change rice into coin, and they take a rake off, and over time, the amount of coin you get for your rice goes down. The samurai class are increasingly impoverished.
In time, even the shogun himself found his vast stockpiles of rice were worth barely a handful of gold coins. So when the revolution came, he could not afford to defend himself.
One of the reasons why the Tokugawa regime falls is because it doesn't have cash to pay its allies for continued military support. If they had any money at all, the Tokugawa shogunate would have been using it to fund their defense against their warlords.
So the question then remains, if there was no gold, why would anyone spend so much time and effort to try and find a treasure that never really existed?
I think they really believed in this legacy. Especially Mizuno Tomoyuki felt that this was just the destiny of his family, that there was too much in terms of 100-year-old documents to really just give it up.
Regardless of how much Mizuno Tomoyuki believed in the legend, he could not convince his children that the gold really existed. He would be the last in his family's long line of treasure hunters.
He has 3 adult children. None of them have expressed any interest at all in continuing this Mizuno family legacy of searching for the treasure.
Tomoyuki was utterly alone in his quest. But even though he had no one to help him, he continued to dig until his very last days. In 2010, Mizuno Tomoyuki died. The search for the lost treasure of the last shogun died with him. In Rome, deep in the heart of the Vatican, they say there is an amazing object.
It becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Not a painting or icon, but a true image of Jesus Christ. It is called the Veil of Veronica.
The Veronica was believed to be a piece of fabric that touched the face of Christ and then bore a miraculous image.
Venerated for over 1,000 years, this was once the most prized relic in Christendom and an object of pilgrimage. But one man has a shocking revelation. He believes the object in the Vatican is a fake. And he knows because he's found the real one. This is the story of Paul Badde's journey of discovery to find what had happened to the true face of God.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
If he is right, his discovery could have huge implications for the history of the Church and for the future of Christianity itself.
It was the first time for around 500 years that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ.
The story began at a dinner in Turin when journalist and author Paul Badde met German art historian Professor Heinrich Pfeiffer. Father Pfeiffer told Paul an amazing tale that, if true, could rewrite history, be the most significant discovery in Christianity, and show how what was once one of the most venerated objects in the Vatican could be a fraud.
I raised my glass to him and thought he must have been crazy.
The story revolved around a fabulous relic, the Veil of Veronica, whose origins are immortalized in most churches as the so-called sixth station of the cross. The stations of the cross take us through Christ's last terrible journey to his execution.
Every church has these images that we call the Stations of the Cross, and that allows us to accompany Jesus as he makes his way from his condemnation to death by Pontius Pilate right up to the moment of crucifixion and his burial.
Step by step, the stations tell the tale of the horrific suffering Jesus faced in the lead-up to his death.
He was scourged and crowned with thorns before he carried the cross through the narrow streets of Jerusalem.
Along the way, Jesus is met by friends and supporters who share in his pain and suffering. One of them was said to be a woman known as Veronica.
A pious woman of Jerusalem saw Christ suffering and bleeding and sweating, and she took her sweat cloth, which was a cloth she was wearing around her head, and gave it to him to dry his face from blood and sweat.
The legend has it that when Christ handed the cloth back to her, miraculously, an image of his face had transferred to the material. But it is only a story. Veronica herself is not actually mentioned in the Bible.
The legend of Veronica is moving us because it is a legend of compassion and love and a miracle. And it allows us to have an image of Christ.
Whatever its actual origin, stories of a cloth bearing a miraculous image of Christ, not made by human hands, continued to circulate throughout the early Christian period.
There's a whole interconnected network of legends about a miraculous image of Jesus' face, which seem to come from different sources and have different motivations behind them.
Somehow, this miraculous cloth with its image of Christ made its way to Rome.
The first documented evidence of the Veronica being in Rome is from 705, when Pope John VII built a shrine for the Veronica.
By 1200, the Veronica was on permanent display in St. Peter's Basilica, and thousands of people flocked to see it. This image became hugely important to the world of art. Until then, artists had no idea of what Jesus actually looked like. There are no clues in the Gospels, so they depicted him in an idealistic or general way.
There are images of Jesus in the catacombs and elsewhere from the 2nd and 3rd centuries where Jesus just looks like a normal young Roman man, clean-shaven, a bit plump. You can only identify him by the fact that he's performing a miracle. And he's normally doing it in the way that a Roman god would do. So, for example, he's curing someone by touching them with a stick.
But when the Veronica appeared, all that changed. Now, artists and worshippers could look at an actual image of a real face.
It was very visual, and especially in the Middle Ages, the visual side of the faith was tremendously important. Having this imprint of Christ's face was almost as good as having a photograph.
You had an idea how God, who became man, really looks. God was not an idea, it was a face. God got a face, a human face.
This same face was seen and copied by many of the great artists and appeared in more and more works. It became the model for Jesus. The characteristics are always the same: the parted hair, the thin beard, the nose and mouth.
The Veronica was copied widely, and the simplified image of Christ's face was distributed across the world.
In fact, this image became so popular that a whole guild of specialist artists was created just to meet the demand.
From the middle of the 14th century, you get really clear evidence for people who are reproducing the Veronica and reproducing the holy images of Rome and selling those on as copies, but copies which bear the same spiritual authority and miracle-working power that the original did.
The Veronica proved not only a potent symbol, but also a great source of revenue as an object of pilgrimage.
The Veronica becomes a very important relic in Rome, that there's a chapel dedicated to it in St. Peter's. It soon becomes even the symbol of pilgrimage to Rome. So it becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Successive popes used the Veronica to increase their prestige and influence.
Innocent III is particularly interested in promoting the Veronica, in part to promote the city of Rome itself and to encourage the pilgrimage to Rome.
Pope Innocent III granted indulgences for those who prayed before the Veronica, gave it its own feast day, and even promenaded it around the city.
The highlight of the Holy Year was the showing of the Veronica, because this was the encounter with Christ on earth when you were still alive.
Eventually, the Veronica became big business. Numbers visiting Rome became so vast that the decision was made to tear down the old Basilica of St. Peter's and rebuild it.
One of the ways in which popes of the early Renaissance proclaimed their authority and created their legacy was through major building projects. And St. Peter's is a good example of a Renaissance pope crafting his legacy with an oversized building project.
Dominating the center of this magnificent new basilica is the altar, which according to tradition was built above the tomb of St. Peter.
And then around it, they have these 4 pillars where they place the relics which were so popular in the Middle Ages: the head of St. Andrew, the Veil of Veronica, the Holy Lance, and also part of the True Cross. And each of these relics, in a sense, being a cornerstone, a pillar of this new Basilica of St. Peter's, the heart of the church.
In other words, the Veronica had become one of the great pillars of the Catholic Church. But then Rome entered a dark period of disruption and violence, and everything changed. On the 6th of May, 1527, Rome was looted and attacked, ironically, by the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor.
The sack of Rome was a catastrophe for the Roman Church. For 1,000 years, Rome was a safe place, where all the pilgrims and the kings and the emperors who came to Rome left important donations at St. Peter.
In an orgy of violence, 500 men were slain in front of the altar, and many of the relics it had housed disappeared.
According to the contemporary reports, the most important relics were given away in a pub, and drinking soldiers were drying their mouth with the Veil of Veronica.
In time, the dust settled, and the new St. Peter's Basilica was finally completed and consecrated. But by then, something had obviously changed. Although the Vatican still claimed to have the Veronica safe, it was no longer on public display. And on the rare occasions when it was shown, it seemed to look different.
Suddenly the Veronica was not a clear, shiny image anymore, but a dark cloth with some traces of blood.
It led some to wonder if the original face of God had been lost.
So the big question is, what happened to the original Veronica, the beautiful Veronica, which was painted by the painters in the Middle Ages? It disappeared. And here we have the discovery of Father Pfeiffer.
At the dinner in Turin, Father Pfeiffer outlined his theory to Paul Badde, that the real face of God was no longer in the Vatican. Paul was skeptical. He had been warned of Pfeiffer's fantastical claims before. But Father Pfeiffer went further, claiming he knew where the real Veronica was now. 120 miles away, in a small town called Manoppello.
He said, yes, there is something quite unknown on a little remote hilltop in the Abruzzi Mountains. He said, how come the whole world doesn't know of it? He said, yeah, that's a mystery. And, he made it even more mysterious. And so it was just completely unbelievable.
Paul dismissed the whole theory.
I thought it's a fine story, but that was it. I wasn't even curious about it.
But this chance meeting would prove to be a turning point in Paul's life. Some months later, whilst traveling with his daughter down the Adriatic coast, Paul found himself near Manoppello, and the church that Father Pfeiffer had claimed was the home to the real Veronica.
Then we got there, and I thought it was about lunchtime, so maybe we could have a little lunch up there and have a look at it.
The town of Manoppello, nestled within the mountainous region of Abruzzo, is in a remote area, off the beaten track, and largely forgotten by the outside world.
We got off the highway, the restaurant was closed, and I got here to the church.
Walking into the church, Paul saw the image for the first time.
The church had a mass, and after the mass I got up there, and this image was just, he looked at me.
Paul was immediately struck by the eyes, the gaze of Christ on this transparent image.
Seeing somebody's face is really seeing the person. Looking into somebody's eyes, looking at their expression, we can learn so much about that person. We believe that God became man in Jesus Christ, and to be able to see that face as it existed in his humanity, it would be a wonderful link with the divine nature.
Paul noticed that the material was so fine that in certain light, the image almost vanished, only returning when illuminated by a torch.
It is constantly exposed, and you can walk nearby, you can walk around, you can take pictures from any direction, and you can see how the light from the many windows in the church go through it. You can put your hand behind it, you can see your hand. You can put a newspaper behind it, and you can read the newspapers because it is so thin and so fine. And when you get very close to it, you see that the image itself is translucent. You don't see any color.
Paul could have gazed at the image forever, but was pressed for time.
My daughter, she was very impatient. She said, let's get off, I'm hungry, let's have something to eat. So she dragged me away, but I had to look at it one more time. And then he looked at me as if somebody who would just be awakening.
Deeply affected, but not sure of what he'd just seen, Paul couldn't bring himself to believe it was the real thing. And after leaving, put it to one side. Two years passed, and after working abroad as the Jerusalem correspondent for the German daily newspaper Die Welt, Paul returned to Rome. It was here that the Veronica reappeared in his life once again.
So around the corner, I saw a little poster announcing, not a press conference, a lecture of a certain Pater Pfeiffer. So that's my Pater Pfeiffer. So I have to see him. I have to see him again. I have to see what he's going to tell me about the image.
Father Heinrich Pfeiffer is a German Jesuit scholar specializing in medieval religious art.
Father Pfeiffer is one of the leading art historians of the Christian world, a highly educated man and very important art historian.
During the course of the lecture, Father Pfeiffer reiterated his claim that the Manoppello image is the Veil of Veronica. During the talk, Paul was struck by the detail in the magnified close-ups. Seeing them brought a sudden revelation. It was real, and he believed in it.
And I thought, this is it. It must be, everything must be true. But these images, there's no comparison to it. I hadn't seen photos like this before.
He was so fascinating, but it became the mission of his life to spread the message of the human image of God around the world.
Paul was desperate to tell the world about these miraculous images and write a book, but he knew how hard it would be to convince people. It was a formidable challenge. He would need a lot of evidence to win over skeptics. The first question is, how can there even be a face displayed in Manoppello if there is already a Veil of Veronica in the Vatican?
Every year on Passion Sunday at 5 p.m., you can see what today is venerated in St. Peter as the Veronica, because the canons of St. Peter's appear on the balcony and bless the faithful with the modern-day Veronica, which is in a huge, heavy silver frame. But you can't see a human face.
Drawing on all his Roman contacts, he tried to secure a meeting with the Vatican authorities. Eventually, in summer of 2004, after much persistence, he was granted an audience with Professor Arnold Nesselrath.
He's a director of the Vatican Museums. He's a very prestigious position. He's a high respected person in the world of art.
Keen to learn the Vatican's angle on the Manoppello image, Paul met with Professor Nesselrath. He eagerly showed him pictures of the Manoppello face. And questioned the professor about what it could be. But Professor Nesselrath would not be drawn into the debate about the Manoppello image.
He had heard something of it, and he had heard something of Pater Pfeiffer. And he was from the big front who had decided about Pater Pfeiffer that he's not to be taken serious.
Professor Nesselrath would neither lend any credence to the Manoppello image, nor let Paul see the Vatican's Veronica. When pressed to go and examine the image in Manoppello for himself, the professor declined, claiming it was beyond his jurisdiction. The official channels had got him nowhere. He needed a different approach for his investigation. If he can't see the Vatican's image, he needed to find out more about the one in Manoppello. When had it arrived, and how had it got there?
The problem with something like the image of Manoppello is that there just isn't a paper trail, basically. So we know this object has been here in Manoppello for a certain amount of time. We know that it arrived there under certain circumstances, but before that, who knows, basically. There's just no way of telling.
Paul realized that if it is real, then the most likely time for its arrival in Manoppello would have been around 1527, during the sack of Rome. And there seemed to be a link. Paul's research showed that Pope Clement took refuge in the Castle Sant'Angelo after the sack of Rome. Something as valuable as the Veronica wouldn't have been left behind. Whilst waiting for the looting to end, Paul thought it possible that the commander of the castle had it spirited away to safety, far from Rome. Intriguingly, the commander had an estate in Manoppello, and it all seemed to make sense.
One very realistic perspective is Paul Badde believes in, that the Castello Sant'Angeli, who had land in Manoppello, safeguarded it and brought it there to protect it.
But confusingly, there is another version of events.
In 1506, a stranger appeared in Manoppello and gave it to a local. And this local wanted to ask questions, but suddenly the stranger disappeared and he believed he was an angel.
This didn't add up, as 1506 is 21 years before the sack of Rome. Paul then looked at what was happening in Rome during this period and discovered very little was written about the Veronica for 100 years after the sack of Rome, until the consecration of St. Peter's Basilica in 1626. Officially, the Veronica was still there, housed within one of the 4 famous pillars. But Paul discovered something puzzling. In 1629, Pope Urban VIII stopped the veil being displayed. The lucrative trade in copies was prohibited, and he demanded all existing copies be destroyed on pain of excommunication. It was as if someone was trying to hide something.
It was important to recall all the images of the Veronica which has disappeared, and to wait until it disappears from the memory of pilgrims and Christian faithful.
Paul discovered that the story of an angel bringing the image to Manoppello first appeared during the time the images were being destroyed. When the Manoppello image was scrutinized, 12 townspeople came up with the story that their face of God was brought to them by an angel long before the sack of Rome. To Paul, now this story made sense. The villagers had used this tale to pretend their image couldn't possibly be of the real Veronica, and by doing so, had protected their image from destruction.
It was to disguise something. And then they invented a story, that an angel has brought it here, what you can do easily in Italy, because Italy is full of saints. Miracles are not strange to Italians.
Only after time had passed did the Vatican start showing the Veronica again. But it seemed different and much darker.
The replacement was not a good or bad copy, but something completely different. You had to destroy the original images and replace them by what you have. Later, the Vatican gave out new prints of the Veronica, which resembled what they have today. But this is a clear indication that the original relic disappeared and was exchanged.
The evidence for this can be found in art. Now, not only did it look completely different, so did the copies made by artists. It all seemed to suggest that the original had been lost. Paul was now certain that the original couldn't be in the Vatican, and that at some point the image was exchanged and a new one put in its place. But to prove that, he needed more evidence. He looked at early descriptions of the veil. In the past, it was recorded as being almost transparent. Even the Protestant reformer Martin Luther said it was like a translucent piece of linen. Unlike the blackened image in the Vatican, the Manoppello image fitted that description.
There are many compelling reasons to think that that might be the case. The fact that the veil is transparent, that we can see through it, and we knew that was the case for the medieval Veronica.
Paul's attempts to see the Vatican's Veronica continued to be rebuffed. Thinking laterally, he decided to visit their vast treasury museum. He was looking for any evidence that would tie the Manoppello image to Rome before 1527.
In the treasury of St. Peter's, there is a broken frame in which the Veronica was once kept, a frame that you could observe from both sides, just like in Manoppello, and roughly the same dimensions.
For Paul, it was another clue. Only a transparent image that could be viewed from both sides would ever be displayed in this way.
To have a frame which is translucent only makes sense if you have a translucent cloth, like the Veil of Manoppello. The dimensions fit. And this is why we believe that the original Veronica, which was venerated in this frame, is what we today call the Veil of Manoppello.
If the true Veronica was still in the Vatican, why had this frame been smashed and the original cut away?
Taking all the information together which we have, there's no doubt about it. It must have been the sack of Rome.
Paul concluded it was the Manoppello image that was torn from this smashed frame. The image even has a glass chip still embedded in it.
The whole story of this frame is giving even more credence to the theory of Professor Pfeiffer and Paul Badde that the true Veronica of the Middle Ages is a Manoppello today.
It is a conflict about plausibility. If somebody comes up with a theory which is more plausible, I'm the first one to applaud it, the first one.
For Paul, the evidence linking the Manoppello image to the original Veronica was conclusive. He was certain that they are one and the same. This now begged the biggest question of all. Could this really be the face of God? And if so, how had it been created? Paul went back to the original story and looked for clues. The problem is, Saint Veronica doesn't exist in the Bible.
One of the striking features of the Western version of the legend is the character of Veronica herself, a saint kind of created by clerical error, if you like. The name obviously derives from the Latin for the true icon, or Latin and Greek. The true image of Christ becomes the Vera Icone Veronica. You've invented a saint.
In other words, there never was a Veronica. Her name simply referred to the cloth itself.
The legend of Veronica was only one of many attempts to explain what we really have. But the name is revealing what we are talking about. Vera Iconia, the true image, was not the name of a woman, but the name of the image.
The implications of this are enormous. If Veronica did not exist, then the image could not have been created when she had wiped Jesus' face on the way to the crucifixion. So how did it get there? Paul examined the material itself and discovered how extraordinarily fine it was. It didn't look like linen or even silk. But what could it be? Researching on the internet, he came across an ancient fabric called byssus.
There are several types of byssus in antiquity, but the most precious one was created from the silk of a shell of a mussel. It's called Pinna nobilis. It's a very large Mediterranean mussel, 90 centimeters. Large thing.
Divers harvested byssus by hand. It took thousands of threads to make the smallest piece of silk. And as a result, it was extremely valuable. Byssus was so precious, it had long been revered as a religious material. Critically, it was used during the time of Christ.
It was the most precious fabric in the antique times. You find it in the graves of the pharaohs in Egypt. You find it in the cloth of the high priest, the ephod made of byssus. In the curtain of the temple, byssus was mentioned. It's mostly translated in English, for instance, shining linen.
But was the Manoppello image made of byssus? Continuing his research, Paul tracked down a woman in Sardinia, the last mussel silk cultivator. He flew her to Manoppello to see the image for herself.
We brought her here to the image of the veil. She got on her knees. She said, "Oh, Dio, Dio, that's byssus. That's mussel silk."
Byssus was far too valuable to have been used as something to mop up sweat. So how might the image have got there? Paul went back to the Bible to look for clues. After Jesus died, he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb with the different cloths needed for his burial. A shroud to wrap the body and a veil to cover his face.
Everybody was expecting to do the final burial on Sunday morning. That's why the women returned to wash and clean and embalm the body. When they came, the body had disappeared. The tomb was empty. He was not there anymore, because he was not dead anymore. He had risen.
In John chapter 20, there's that wonderful description of Peter and John running to the empty tomb. They've just heard from the women that Jesus is no longer in the tomb, and they go and investigate. The Gospels are very clear that when the disciples entered the empty tomb, there were various burial cloths lying around, not just the shroud, but amongst others, the cloth that was around the face of Christ.
Such a funeral veil would have been made of a fine, valuable material like byssus. Could it have been that whilst wrapped around Jesus' head, it had miraculously taken on the image of his face.
The Church clearly believes in the supernatural. It clearly believes in the miraculous. It clearly believes that the divine can work in the world. So it's certainly open to the possibility of images made without human hands. It was the image of a Christ who is alive, rather than the image that we find on the Shroud of Turin, the image of a dead man.
For the early Christians, it must have been a revelation that not only the body of the suffering Christ was imprinted on the burial cloth, but we also have the face of the resurrected Christ on a veil. And of course, both relics were venerated and given from generation to generation.
So could the Manoppello image have been made by a miraculous process? Skeptics have often claimed that the Manoppello image must just be a painting. But Paul discovered Byssus has an unusual quality. You cannot dye or paint on it.
Paul Badde verified it is indeed not ordinary silk, but shell silk which you cannot paint. There are some very small pigments by medieval painters who try to refresh or to intensify colors in some point, or maybe even try to put fur images against it to get the replica blessed by the original. We call it second-class relic or relic by touch. But Paul Badde verified it is not a human being.
For Paul, all the pieces supporting his belief in the truth behind the Manoppello image were fitting into place. From the Bible, he believed he had deduced what the cloth itself was used for.
Rather than being the cloth used by that pious woman as Jesus carried the cross, that it was actually one of the burial cloths of our Lord.
From paintings, he saw how the same image had been revered in Rome throughout the Middle Ages.
If you compare the Volto Santo of Manoppello with all the paintings we have of the Veronica in Rome, they are identical. They're identical even in details.
And from the broken frame, he could see how it had been saved after the sacking of Rome and sent to Manoppello, where it had been quietly forgotten for nearly 500 years.
It's so evident. This is the veil. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you could rip my skin off. I mean, this is it.
For Paul Badde, the story of Manoppello's face of God was almost complete, and he could start writing up his theory. After completing his research, he sent all his evidence along with photographs to Pope John Paul II. It had been an incredible journey.
I couldn't believe it, but the whole story. Every time and again, I had to pinch myself because it's a miraculous story.
Paul's work found a wide audience. Not only was it seen by Pope John Paul, but also by Cardinal Ratzinger, the leading authority on Catholic doctrine and thought, who complimented Paul on his work. And then, out of the blue on Sunday the 13th of March 2005, Paul Badde was granted an extraordinary opportunity to see the version of the Veronica in the Vatican. Making his way into St. Peter's, he was aware that this could be the final piece of the puzzle.
I don't know how come that I have seen it, that all of a sudden the doors open, I could enter the column.
Within the Veronica column is a staircase leading to a small chapel housing the actual image itself.
Of course, Paul Badde has seen what they believe to be the Veronica in the Vatican right now and had the opportunity to see this relic from close by.
In the depths of the Veronica column, he finally saw the Veil of Veronica. But it was a dark, unrecognizable image, nothing like the old artist's reproductions, and it was housed in a heavy, ornate picture frame. Clearly, this was a completely different image.
What I saw there, I saw a big silver frame. You see this hoax, as I might call it, or copy. Everything had disappeared.
He was even denied permission to photograph it. The Vatican have taken their own photos, but they are rarely shown.
The reason why they don't publish these pictures is they don't want to disappoint the faithful by revealing that there is no face on the Veronica anymore.
To this day, no pope has openly admitted that the Vatican Veronica ever disappeared, or that the barely visible face shown today is anything other than what had always been on display. But Paul had no doubt about what had really happened.
It was a trick. It was a trick from the 500 years ago, from these times of Machiavelli.
Paul is certain that this trick or hoax was deliberately perpetrated to maintain the illusion that the Vatican still had the real one. But if this had happened hundreds of years ago, why not admit it now?
I think there's no question that having the Veronica in your church, if you happen to be the Pope, would be an incredibly useful asset. You know, it's an item of incredible holiness and power. Everyone is awestruck by it. You're going to get a lot of people coming to see it, and it shores up your power, effectively, as leader of the church.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
For Rome and her powerful popes, such a monumental loss of face would have been deeply embarrassing.
It's a catastrophe for the Church of Rome. We lost the face of God. Not the faith in God, but the face of God.
Paul thought there may have been another reason why the hoax was perpetrated. The Veronica had earned the church a lot of money.
They did not come to see St. Peter. They did not even come to see the Pope, as they do today. They wanted to see the veil.
Pilgrims had to be shown something, and that's just what happened. What started as a small hoax was simply allowed to continue until it became widely believed.
It's easy to dismiss it as just a cynical cashing-in exercise, and I'm sure it was partly a cynical cashing-in exercise. But it was also a way of making that pilgrimage real. I mean, remember, the whole idea of pilgrimage, at least in theory, is to take part in the physicality of something holy.
But others are more sympathetic about why the Veronica might have been replaced.
First of all, I have to disagree with both Father Pfeiffer and my dear friend Paul Badde in the idea that the canons of St. Peter perpetrated a hoax, a pious forgery, a pious fraud. I do not believe it. I believe they were hysterically searching for something and just took the second best and believed it because they wanted to believe it, that this is the right Veronica.
On April the 2nd, 2005, Pope John Paul II died. He was succeeded by the man who had complimented Paul on his book, Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI.
On the 1st of September 2006, Pope Benedict visited Manoppello. Often he visited Italian shrines to venerate the relics or the local traditions. And there's that very evocative image of Pope Benedict just staring at the veil in Manoppello. There's a real sense of an encounter, encountering face to face with Christ. He was clearly very moved.
For Paul, this was the justification for all his hard work.
When he came to Manoppello for the first Pope, then he prayed here in silence, he bowed, he bent his knee in front of it, and then for more than 8 minutes he's been in silent prayer in front of it. I mean, it was very, very moving.
It was the first time, for we believe around 500 years, that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ, of the resurrected Christ.
Pope Benedict's visit changed everything.
A week later, on St. Peter's Square, in the next audience, he said, if we want to know who God is, then we only have to look into the face of his Son, and there we see who God is and how God is.
Although not actually authenticating the image, Pope Benedict's personal visit gave credibility to those that believed this was the true face of God.
He brought the image back into the world. That's what he did.
Paul and many of the faithful believe there is no doubting that this image is genuine. But there will always be skeptics. They want proper scientific evidence to show how the image got there and how old it is. The guardians at Manoppello aren't against testing, as long as it is non-invasive and so doesn't damage the veil. They hope science will develop in the future, allowing for a more detailed examination which they are sure will vindicate their claims. If this happens, then the Veil of Veronica would become one of the most significant discoveries in Christian history.
Just as the Veronica was a very popular relic in the Middle Ages, we're now entering a new period, a revival of this interest in the Holy Face, searching for the face of God, searching for that personal encounter with him.
St. Paul wrote in his letters, if Christ did not resurrect, our faith is worthless. So the veneration of the Volto Santo is concentrating the attention of Christianity back onto the image of the resurrected Christ. And that's important.
From the Knights of the Round Table to the Nazis, the Holy Grail is the world's most sought-after Christian relic.
It symbolizes redemption, it symbolizes salvation, it symbolizes eternal life.
This was the cup said to have been used by Jesus at the Last Supper.
Objects that had come in contact with the body of Christ were particularly important.
Credited with supernatural powers, it has been sought by knights and treasure hunters for centuries.
It's this incredible holy object that you search for on a great quest.
But were they all looking in the wrong places? Because one person thinks she has found it. Janice Bennett believes an agate cup in the Cathedral of Valencia is the Holy Grail. What's more, it has been on display there for more than 500 years.
It's an important relic, it's an important symbol of Christianity, and it deserves attention and veneration.
This is the story of her quest to uncover the truth.
It really had all the makings of being one of the greatest stories in the history of humanity.
If she is right, this is an amazing tale of courage and survival that could finally lay to rest the mystery of the Holy Grail. In 1991, whilst on holiday in Spain, American writer and historian Janice Bennett visited the ancient city of Valencia. After walking around the old quarter, she decided to visit the magnificent cathedral. It was here, quite by accident, that she stumbled on something bizarre and intriguing.
I happened to notice a small chapel in the cathedral as I was leaving.
Entering the chapel, she saw an illuminated shrine behind the high altar containing a small chalice. Richly studded with pearls, rubies, and emeralds, this is Valencia Cathedral's most prized possession, the Santo Calice, also known in English as the Holy Grail.
The Holy Grail was a drinking vessel which was venerated. And the legends say why it was venerated. It was venerated as the cup of Christ from the Last Supper.
According to Christian belief, the Last Supper was the final meal Jesus shared with his apostles in Jerusalem before he was betrayed and crucified.
He took the bread and he said, "This is my body," and he broke the bread and shared it with his disciples. And then he took the cup and he said, "This is my blood, the blood of the new and everlasting covenant." And once again, the disciples drank from the cup. And then he said, crucially, "Do this in memory of me." So this was not just a one-off meal, it was something that he wanted his followers to repeat.
One of the core beliefs of Christianity, the sacrament of the Eucharist, or Holy Communion, derives from the words spoken by Jesus at that meal. The act has become central to all Christian worship.
The Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life. It's really at the heart of everything we do, everything we believe. We believe that Christ is present under the appearance of bread and wine. And when we receive the bread and wine at communion, we are receiving Jesus. We are one with him.
But on that day in Valencia, to Janice it seemed almost absurd. Surely she couldn't be standing just a few meters away from the Holy Grail.
I really didn't feel anything when I looked at it. It didn't speak to me in any way. And I wasn't captivated by it. I wasn't particularly impressed.
Janice noticed that none of the other visitors seemed particularly awestruck either.
As I recall, there were only one or two other people in the chapel. They seemed to be either disinterested or, at the very least, unaware of what they were actually seeing.
But even so, Janice's interest was piqued to find out more.
I looked in the gift shop in the cathedral. The only thing I could find was a small brochure that had been rather poorly translated from Spanish into English.
It didn't say much, but reading the booklet, Janice began to discover a little more about the chalice's history. She was hardly the first to be drawn into the mystery of the Holy Grail.
The interest in chalices emerges from a desire to come in contact with something that had actually come in contact with the body of Christ.
For centuries, Grail hunters from all over the world have been searching for this miraculous object.
It symbolizes redemption, it symbolizes salvation, it symbolizes eternal life. And in a way, the Holy Grail stands for man's quest for God, man's quest for truth.
The Holy Grail in the Middle Ages became the motif of a lot of legends and romances and poetry, became the symbol of the aspiration of any Christian knight to go on a quest for the Holy Grail.
This is an incredible holy object that you search for on a great quest. It represents chastity and purity.
Along the way, it has become shrouded in myths and mystical powers.
It heals wounds, it offers salvation.
So much so that even at the height of the Nazi regime, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, searched for the Grail, believing its powers would help win him the war. He converted a great castle into a modern-day Camelot, with a ritual chamber and its own round table. He planned to display the Grail here, but he too failed in his quest.
It's become the one object in the world that is almost impossible to attain. It's become a symbol of something far beyond human aspirations, the absolute pinnacle of what we desire.
So over the centuries, the Grail has received many associations. Everything from St. Joseph of Arimathea and Glastonbury, King Arthur and his knights, the Templars, and more recently, Dan Brown, Indiana Jones, Monty Python. But essentially, beneath all these stories and myths is this idea of a cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper the night before he was crucified.
So could this object in Valencia be the true cup of Christ? That same one everyone has been searching for? Janice's research showed whether this was or wasn't the real Grail, people had been prepared to die for it.
I found a very small booklet that had been written by Olmos Canalda. Now, he was a Spanish priest who was actually responsible for saving this chalice from destruction during the Spanish Civil War.
In the 1930s, Spain was a deeply divided country, politically torn between right-wing nationalist and left-wing Republican parties. As the Great Depression hit, the country fell into turmoil. After the king abdicated, the Republicans were elected to power and the army rebelled. Spain was in a state of civil war. And like all civil wars, atrocities were committed by both sides.
It was a time of great violence and strife, and it's often forgotten that the church itself had a very difficult time. It was persecuted. 13 Spanish bishops were put to death at the hands of the communists.
Many churches were desecrated, plundered, things stolen, reliquaries stolen, priests and nuns and religious killed by the communists who had a hate against the church, which was a symbol for the ancient regime.
In this climate, there was no respect for relics. Valencia and the chalice were in danger. At 9 a.m. on the 21st of July 1936, 4 people celebrated Mass with the Holy Chalice for the last time.
As they said Mass, hordes of soldiers began to surround the cathedral. They were very concerned. One priest locked and bolted the doors. At 10 o'clock, they felt the situation was so serious that they came up with a very dangerous plan. There just happened to be one woman in attendance at this Mass named Maria Sabina Sway. So they asked her to carry out this rather dangerous mission. They enveloped the chalice in silk, wrapped it in a newspaper, and planned to smuggle it out.
Sneaking through the church crypt, she carried her precious parcel beneath her coat. She had to walk through groups of armed soldiers. At any moment, they could discover her hidden treasure. But luck was on her side. Her brave action was just in time.
They entered the chapel of the Holy Grail. They burned all the pews and confessionals. They even burned the tabernacle where it had been kept. The fire was so intense that many paintings and precious works of art were destroyed.
But despite the destruction, the chalice had escaped. When the war finally ended, on March the 30th, 1939, it was brought out of its hiding place in the countryside and returned to the authorities in Valencia, where the chalice has remained in the cathedral ever since.
That story really impressed me, so much so that I felt that even if this weren't the real Holy Grail, I didn't feel it would be a waste of time to investigate it because it was so deserving of having its story told by its own merits.
But the key question for Janice was, if this was the real Grail, how had it got from the Holy Land in the 1st century to 21st century Spain?
Well, of course, it was very important for me to trace the story of this chalice from the beginning. You know, how did it get from Jerusalem to Spain?
Janice needed to work out how the cup might have left Jerusalem in the first place.
Establishing the authenticity of any object that supposedly goes back to Jesus, whether it be the chalice, the cross, the nails, is incredibly difficult, and it requires an awful lot of detective work.
So Janice focused on the events following the Last Supper. Going back to the earliest traditions of the Church, she discovered St. Peter was said to have gone from Jerusalem to Rome, where he became the first pope.
Well, we believe that St. Peter was made the head of the church by Jesus himself. He's given the name Peter, which means rock. He is the rock on which the church is built.
Janice felt it likely that because of his importance in early Christianity, St. Peter would have been given the cup and taken it to Rome.
Certainly, something as precious as the cup used by Jesus at that Last Supper surely would have been saved in some way, surely would have been passed down, and St. Peter is the likely sort of person who might end up with it.
She believed he would have then used this cup to celebrate the first Eucharist.
Christians felt that Relics were extremely important because they were really a link between past and present. They represented something that was sacred, something beyond human comprehension.
But the fact that it could have been given to St. Peter was hardly proof. She needed to find more evidence. She looked into the earliest traditions of the Eucharist and discovered that when the Mass was codified, it had a very particular form of words.
In the Roman Catholic Mass, we have two different versions of the consecration. You have the general canon and the Roman canon. And the Roman canon says not Christ took the cup in his hands, but it says hunc praeclarem calicem, what means this very chalice.
By saying this very chalice, did it mean that when the popes celebrated Mass then, they were using the actual Holy Grail from the Last Supper? Janice believed what is just tradition now was based on actual facts back then.
The Roman canon of the Mass are the words that Jesus spoke at the Last Supper. It originated in Rome with St. Peter and his followers, his successors. So many scholars would believe that this was the actual cup that had been used by Christ and that the popes were very well aware of that fact.
But 200 years after St. Peter may have brought the cup to Rome, disaster struck. Janice discovered that in 257, the Emperor Valerian instigated a systematic persecution of Christians. The bishops of Rome and Carthage were both beheaded, and the Bishop of Toulouse was tied to the tail of a bull and had his brains bashed out.
The Valerian persecution, I think there was more of an effort to just, well, literally, in every sense, decapitate the church. So take the leaders, just kill them by decapitation. Straightforward execution, you know. This is what will happen to you if you carry on in your insane, eccentric religious beliefs.
The Pope at the time was Sixtus II. Knowing he will be executed, the one thing he can do is preserve the cup. Janice read how he summoned a deacon of the church, a Spaniard called Lawrence, and asked him to safeguard the treasure. But the question was, had the Grail been part of those treasures?
So just on a whim, I started flipping through the files, hoping maybe I could find something about the life of St. Lawrence that might mention the fact that he had actually sent this cup of the Last Supper to Spain.
Janice then continued her research and came across an amazing discovery. A copy of a 17th century manuscript containing material she'd never seen before on the life of St. Lawrence.
This I felt was so significant that I ordered copies of the entire manuscript, had them sent to my home in the United States, and began to translate them.
Janice Bennett had discovered the manuscript of Abbot Donato. It told how Pope Sixtus had given the Grail to Lawrence, who, after defying the might of Rome, was put to death in the most horrific manner.
He was placed on a gridiron, having been stripped naked, and he was slowly roasted to death. But such was St. Lawrence's faith and courage that he was able to make light of the situation and even jest as he was being roasted on that gridiron. And he even said at one stage, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side."
But critically, Janus learned from the manuscript that before Lawrence died, he too had passed the chalice on to a fellow Spaniard.
Donato is very explicit. He says, "And he gave to Priscillius, a co-disciple from the homeland of Spain, the cup in which Christ consecrated his blood on the night of the Last Supper." So here we have this direct, very explicit reference. It also provides the name of the Spaniard to whom Lawrence entrusted such an important relic.
So the chalice had escaped with Priscillius, and Janus was building a strong case for Lawrence, getting the Grail to Spain.
According to tradition, he managed to get a Spanish soldier, a legionnaire from Spain, to carry this relic to Huesca, where the parents of St. Lawrence had an estate. So it was kept by the parents, and it was safe there.
So could the chalice have been taken to Huesca, a town in northeastern Spain? Janus traveled there and discovered at first hand how strong the cult of St. Lawrence remains there today. Further evidence linking the Grail to Spain.
In Huesca, it is so evident the importance that St. Lawrence has had for the people for so many years, that this tradition is so deeply enrooted in their culture that the entire town seems to be dedicated to him. I mean, you see these martyrdom motifs everywhere. 3 churches dedicated to St. Lawrence. Really, it's amazing.
But if the chalice had been taken to Huesca, it was there that the trail went cold. And what's more, this coincided with the greatest period of turmoil and religious conflict in Spanish history, the Muslim invasion.
I think it was safe then in Huesca, but the problem was that the Muslims came up from Africa and invaded Spain in the year 711. So at that time, Christians were really forming caravans all over Spain, going to the mountains in the northern parts to hide all the relics because they knew that they weren't safe.
For the next 250 years, there was no mention of the Holy Grail. But then, the records say that in 1037, it reappeared in a secluded monastery high in the Pyrenees.
I think the first time I went to San Juan de la Peña, I was immediately struck by this location. An absolutely magnificent monastery, very simple, but in such an incredible setting in the Pyrenees that it really invokes awe.
San Juan de la Peña was an important strategic location, a burial place of Spanish kings and a safe haven for relics.
A good part of northern Spain stayed Christian throughout this entire process, and that remained a stronghold and the point of resistance against Muslim occupation.
We know the chalice was here in 1037 because of a remarkable historic event.
It was the place where the first Mass in Latin language was celebrated in 1037 at a council where the Roman Mass was introduced into Mozarabic Spain. So when the papal delegate introduced and celebrated for the first time the Roman Mass, he consecrated with this important relic.
After the cardinal had used the holy cup of the Last Supper in the celebration of the Mass, San Juan de la Peña became a center for pilgrimage.
So there were thousands of people every year passing by. They liked to tell their stories of the relics along the way. And so the knowledge of this relic became very well known throughout Europe.
However it had got there, from this point on, the cup was hugely venerated on this site as the Holy Grail. Janice believed she had found a firm trail of evidence, taking the chalice from Jerusalem to Rome and now to the north of Spain. She now needed to discover how it got to Valencia. Janice read that after centuries safely stored in the remote monastery of San Juan de la Peña, the Grail was on the move once again. Reading the monastery's records, she discovered how, on September the 26th, 1399, the cup she had seen in the Cathedral of Valencia was handed over by the monks as a gift to the king.
It sets forth all the details of this transfer, of how he took it to his palace, the Aljaferia in Saragossa. And he mentions the fact that this is the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper and that it was sent to Spain by St. Lawrence.
From then on, she found out that successive monarchs kept the Grail with them, and it moved about their royal courts from Zaragoza to Barcelona, and then finally, Valencia.
And you see it is moving more and more south because during the centuries, the front between the Christianites and the Muslims moved more and more to the south until in 1492, Spain was completely Christian again.
By 1428, the chalice was in the Cathedral of Valencia, where it has remained ever since. For Janice, it was all coming together. Finally, she believed she had tracked the complete journey of the chalice from Jerusalem to Valencia. But it was now that the difficult questions began. It could conceivably have been a cup that had come from Rome, but that didn't mean it was the cup of Christ used at the Last Supper. Proving that would be much more difficult.
I did most of the work at home, of course. I would have copies of everything made in the National Library or wherever I found them, or when possible, I bought the books themselves and brought them home with me so that I could do it in my own home and piece everything together that way. I took many photographs along the way so that I would have that record as well.
Amongst the problems she faced were the many rival grails.
Well, we believe that by the 16th century, there were at least 20 chalices or other objects that claimed to be the Holy Grail.
There are three well-known grails today. The Genoa chalice, now proven to be a glass dish of Islamic origin.
Then we have the Antioch chalice, which is a beautiful silver work with a lot of decoration and human figures around. But the human figures alone prove that it must be Byzantine, because in Judaism, human figures were forbidden.
And if the Antioch chalice was too recent, then the wooden Nantius cup, with no provenance before the 19th century, was no contender either. One by one, Janice ruled out the pretenders. But how could she prove that the cup in Valencia was the real one? The solution had to be in proper archaeological testing.
For one thing, the object needs at least to be intrinsically plausible. So it needs to be something that does come from the 1st century, or at least plausibly comes from the 1st century, is something that somebody like Jesus, a Jewish peasant from Galilee, might have had, or his sponsors or friends might have had.
Janice discovered that the only detailed independent scientific analysis done on the chalice was by Dr. Antonio Beltran in the 1960s.
Professor Beltran was the professor at the University of Zaragoza, a leading Spanish archaeologist who, in the 1960s, was commissioned by the Archbishop of Valencia to study the relic of the Santo Chalice from an archaeological point of view and to date it.
A prolific academic author and one of Spain's leading archaeologists, Beltran was also an expert on artwork of the ancient world.
Dr. Beltran felt that he didn't have to worry about whether or not it was authentic, that he could just proceed without concern about what the church would think if he saw that this wasn't possible to have been on the table of the Last Supper.
Dr. Beltran's findings were startling. He stated that the chalice was made up of 3 distinct parts: the base, the stem, and the upper cup, and they were all from different periods. The goldwork linking the base to the upper cup was the most recent.
At a certain point, probably in the 14th century, those 2 stone elements are put together. The gold work seems very much in keeping with what gold work is in Spain in the 14th century.
If you see the golden frame, this is clearly a medieval work. There's no question about it.
Dr. Beltran said the base was made of chalcedony stone. He concluded it was probably an inverted incense burner, chosen as a base to support the cup because of its similarity in color and material. But its design and poor quality of craftsmanship indicated it was possibly from as late as the 9th century, and so couldn't have anything to do with the true Grail. Beltran then focused all his attention on the upper cup. It too was made from chalcedony, but exquisitely crafted and of a very high quality, similar to those made at a very specific period of time.
And he dated it into the Hellenistic period, 3rd to 1st century before Christ. And you can prove it very easily that this dating is correct by just comparing it with other archaeological discoveries from this period.
And there was more than it just dating from the right period. According to Beltran, the upper cup was a great example of a luxury stone item from the skilled workshops of the Eastern Mediterranean, the very area Jesus Christ came from.
He said that these stone cups were fabricated in workshops in Egypt, Syria, and the Mediterranean, that they were actually very common in Greek and Roman times, and that they were used on luxurious tables. They were almost entirely made of hard stone, like chalcedony, and they were very expensive to make.
Critically, these valuable vessels stopped being manufactured around 50 AD, when they were replaced by glassware, which was cheaper and quicker to produce. So according to Beltran, the upper cup is definitely of the right design and type, from the right place and period. But trying to tie a specific object to a specific moment in history, like the Last Supper, is almost impossible.
There's no way to prove scientifically it was the cup of Christ. But what you can prove is that there is a possibility that it was used by Christ.
To try and find that proof, Janice went back to the historical context of the Last Supper. Could this have been the type of cup Jesus might have used.
Jesus was Jewish. And the chalice of the Last Supper was used for a Seder, for a Passover meal.
The Bible tells how in the last week of his life, Jesus went to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of Passover. Passover is one of the most important festivals in the Jewish year. At this time, Jewish people remember how God liberated them from slavery under the pharaohs in ancient Egypt. In preparation for the Passover meal, everything must be thoroughly cleansed or koshered. Anything porous or with cavities that cannot be ritually purged isn't used. So the chalice used for wine at the Last Supper had to have been pure. This would have ruled out wood and other materials.
We also did not use a clay chalice, because clay might have had little captivities in it. We did not use silver, because silver was used for pagan coins, and you had pagan deities imprinted on it.
Stone was the obvious answer.
You find stone vessels all over the Holy Land in Jewish settlements from the time of Christ, in which they kept water for purification. So the perfect choice would have been a stone vessel. And indeed, the Holy Grail in Valencia is a stone vessel made out of beautiful agate.
It was the type of cup that would have been used at such a celebration because it was hard, it was non-porous.
But this sheer craftsmanship and quality presented an entirely new problem. How could Jesus, who famously wanted nothing to do with wealth and riches, be using such a valuable cup? Once again, Janice looked to the Bible for clues. Looking back at the accounts of the Last Supper, in the book of Mark, she discovered that the Last Supper was held in a cenacle or dining room. And there was something unusual about this room.
According to Christians and many biblical scholars, the owner of the cenacle was a wealthy man. And we know that because it insinuates that in the Bible, that this was held in an upstairs room. There were servants present.
At that time, having a house with a first floor and servants would imply considerable wealth. If she is right, Jesus was an honored guest of a wealthy family. And on an occasion as special as Passover, it is likely that only the very best tableware would have been used.
So it was natural, because this was a very expensive cup. It would have been priceless for this family even before the Last Supper took place.
So if the upper cup was the type of cup used at the time, it begged the final question. Why had it been joined with medieval goldwork and studded with jewels? Janice discovered that embellishing relics was a popular practice in the Middle Ages.
Obviously, it stands to reason if you've got something incredibly holy, why not make it holier? I mean, you want to give people their money's worth when they come and see it, so deck it up in gold and jewels, whatever you've got to hand. There's a cynical element to that, of course. You know, it is effectively a tourist attraction. But there's also a more spiritual dimension as well. After Constantine, suddenly Christianity becomes a bit more worldly, and there's a greater sense of beauty as a spiritual path. So studying beauty would lead you to the true beauty, that is God. And Christians were quite enthusiastic about this.
But she also discovered there was a practical reason for the cup's transformation into a long-stemmed chalice.
It is easier to celebrate Mass when you have a stem to hold on to and a weighted base. There's less chance of an accident happening. during the Mass. It's about spilling some of the precious blood.
For Janice, it was all making sense.
As all these pieces started coming together for me, I was really amazed by the incredible mosaic of art, culture, and history that was taking shape before my eyes.
From a valued family heirloom blessed by Jesus at the Last Supper, the Grail traveled to Rome and was used by the early popes to establish and practice the Holy Mass. During the Valerian persecutions, this same cup was bravely spirited away to northern Spain, where it had become a rallying point for Christianity. And then from the 14th century, it became a prized treasure of the kings of Aragon, before entering Valencia's cathedral in 1428, where it has remained almost ever since.
It really had all the makings of being one of the greatest stories in the history of humanity.
"11 years after first seeing the chalice, Janice was now convinced that the cup in the Cathedral of Valencia is the Holy Grail.
Really, this whole quest for me, I feel sometimes like I was led on it, that it was from something beyond me, because I have no idea how it happened.
She wrote up all her findings in the form of a book, St. Lawrence and the Holy Grail, the story of the Holy Chalice of Valencia.
It's really now for the first time that people who go to the cathedral and enter the chapel of the Holy Grail can actually appreciate the rich history of this relic, that they can understand all the sacrifices that were made by so many people throughout the centuries, that they can really comprehend all the near misses with destruction this relic has suffered throughout the years, and appreciate its history more.
Of course, it is impossible to say for certain that this is the Holy Grail. There are many skeptics who are sure it isn't, and to a large degree, it comes down to circumstantial evidence.
I guess the Valencia story is as plausible as any is for the last resting place of the Holy Chalice. The problem is it has a whole bunch of weak links. We have to accept that it was kept. We have to accept that it was taken to Rome. We have to accept that the story of Lawrence taking it to Spain is actually true. And we have to accept that, well, they did manage to hang on to it in Spain for all that time. But there's nothing impossible about any of them. You know, we don't need to believe in any miracles for this to be true. So it's possible.
For the faithful, the archaeological evidence doesn't refute the authenticity of the chalice, so no one can rule it out as the Holy Grail. And there are people in Spain who certainly believe it is authentic.
So the chalice is a wonderful link with the past, in the present. It keeps tradition alive. Often it is very important in defining identity, the identity of a particular town or a church or a province. And it does help to unlock the mysteries of our faith, to bring home to people things that happened way back in the biblical past.
In more recent times, the Valencia chalice has become more widely accepted. It seemed to have even received the endorsement of the highest Catholic authority.
In recent years, there have been 2 papal visits to Valencia.
The first was by Pope John Paul II in 1983.
He venerated the Holy Chalice, he touched it. And there's a wonderful picture of him kissing the chalice, and then a bit later he was able to use it at the celebration of Mass. And if we are to believe that this was the custom of the popes in the early centuries of the Church, then it was very much a return to papal custom, papal tradition. and the first time in over 1700 years that the Pope had used that chalice for Mass. It's nice to believe that anyway.
The second papal visit was in 2006, when Pope Benedict XVI also celebrated with the Holy Chalice.
On the square in front of the cathedral, he called it the famous relic of the Santo Calice, which was very important because it was a recognition of the relic status. It was not only a symbol, but indeed a relic.
Pope Benedict's choice of words, this most famous chalice, from the Roman canon, seemed to support the tradition of the Holy Chalice of Valencia without actually authenticating it. But for some of the faithful, the question whether it is or isn't real doesn't matter. What is much more important is the meaning behind the quest for the Grail.
So in a way, the Holy Grail has become bigger than simply an old cup that Jesus may or may not have used at the Last Supper. It really symbolizes something at the very heart of our human life.
For people, for Christians all over the world, this represents salvation. It represents the sacrament of the Eucharist, something beyond this world, something that we can look forward to when we die, a better place where everyone will be happy.
Today, this most famous chalice remains on show in Valencia's great cathedral for all to see, a focal point for belief and worship.
We have to really admire and look at the faith of many, many generations. And in a way, the devotion of generations of Christians gives a relic a certain sanctity in itself. The fact that it's been the focus of prayer, that it's been the means of people encountering God, whether or not the relic is historically valid, that in itself gives a certain authenticity to the relic.